All right, good morning. All right, let's get started. Welcome to the session on learning from failures. My name is Venkat Subramaniam. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk to developers. I want to talk about something where we can learn from every single day. And it really comes down to a lot of times our cultures where we tend to fear making mistakes, fear making errors. But unfortunately, though, that can really block us from innovating quite a bit. So I want to talk about how we can learn from failures and how we can turn that towards a higher chance of success. I want to start by talking about some of my own experiences first, and then some observations along the way. But I want to start with a quote that I made a while ago, and that is, a professional who doesn't learn to fail fails to learn. And so the faster we fail, the more we fail, the higher the chance of us succeeding in the long run. And so as a culture, as an organization, as a team, as an individual, we should really be willing to fail a lot more. And there is a stigma associated with failure oftentimes that really makes it hard for us to fail. But if we can remove that stigma from our own teams, and we don't shy away from failing, we don't ridicule people from failing in our own teams, it can really turn things for the better. So that's one of the reasons why I would say no failure is dire if we take the time to learn from it. And the worst of the failures are the ones where we actually don't learn from it. And I want to start by showing some failures over time. But I often say that I fail a lot, but there are other people who fail maybe a lot or as much as I do. But it's unfair, because when I fail versus a lot of other people fail, there's a difference. When I fail, exactly 3 people know about it: my wife and my 2 children. But when a lot of other people fail, it's on the news, which is very unfair for them. And I get to fail a lot more than others do, because the cost of failure for me is a lot less oftentimes, as I say. But when the failure appears in news, that can be really hard to digest. A lot of our failures are hidden within families, within teams, within companies. But what if it gets out in the world? What if it's a public news? What if it's a colossal failure? What if it's death of people? Well, I think every single failure gives an opportunity for those who survive to learn from and to make better. And that's what I want to talk about today, is some of the failures over time and how we can learn from them. But I'll start with my own experience. I started programming about 35 years ago, and I just fell in love with programming. I still write code every single day because I enjoy the art of writing code and expressing code and our thoughts in code and have them come to life. But I've seen quite a number of failures over these decades. I used to work as a programmer back in time. I'm a consultant these days, which means that I get to see other companies and a lot of other organizations succeed and fail at the same time. But I'll talk about a failure from my own past. This is one project that I worked on years ago, or decades ago rather. And I remember the day when I interviewed with this company. And I literally, when the interview was over, I'm not even exaggerating, and you can imagine this is time before there were cell phones. So you had phones that were stuck to the wall. You had to go punch numbers on that phone and talk to people. And I remember finishing the interview, coming down to the lobby of the company, and asking the attendant there, saying, "Do you mind if I use your phone?" And she said, "Yeah, go ahead and use the phone." And I immediately called my wife and said, "Pray for me. I really want this job. I just finished the interview, and I'm so excited. If I get hired, this will be the fantastic situation to be in." I was that excited, I couldn't even wait to go home to tell her that I had a good interview. And by that time, this company had been creating this software for 3 years. And I joined them, and I worked with them for 3 more years. So now it's 6 years' time, as you can see. At the end of 3 years, I decided to move on. I quit. I left for another job. And about 3.5, 4 years later, so this is about approximately 10 years, since the time this project was created. I was talking to one of my colleagues that I used to work with, and she said she just moved on to another project. And I said to her, oh, wow, that's great. You guys finally finished the application and you shipped it, isn't it? And she said, no, that's not quite what happened. And I was a little shocked. I said, what did you guys do then? And she said, we shelved it. And I've been in programming for a while at that point. I know software lifecycle. I don't know this concept called shelving of software. So I asked her, that's intriguing. What's this shelving of your software that you're talking about? And she got a little agitated, a little angry. She said, we trashed it. We threw it in the trash bin. I said, oh, that's the nice name. This is called euphemism. We people are very polite sometimes. We don't directly say things, right? Back in time, people would say, I have a problem. You don't say that anymore. Bosses freak out when you say you have a problem. You say, I have a challenge, because that sounds a lot nicer, isn't it? And you don't say somebody is stupid. That's rude. You say he is interesting, because that sounds a lot better. And interesting people have challenges to deal with all the time. So she said, we shelved the product. I'm like, I was quite upset. I was upset because, not because I was working for them. I had quit 3+ years ago, right? But I was upset because the 3 years I worked with them, there were several nights I didn't go home. There were several weekends I was at work writing code because I wanted this project to succeed. And I put everything I can into it, and to see that the application never saw the light of the day, they shelved it, was very disheartening. And of course the question is, why did they shelve it? And what happened was, this was a project that took about 10 years to develop. They literally spent $12 million on this application, if you can imagine. In today's dollars, that's $15 million. And they never, ever released it. When they thought they were done, they went to the users and showed what they have. And the users said, oh, this is way too complicated. And it solves very small percentage of the real problem, so we don't care to use it. I think there is a much better way to waste a $15 million, if you will, and that's very disheartening. But what really went wrong in this process? And I say this because even today I come across companies where they develop products for a long time and they are too shy to release it, and they're holding on to it dearly, and that's a very high risk. So one of the key things to keep in mind is you want to release, and real use and real useful, valuable feedback really comes from real use of applications. Now, this is a lesson I learned the hard way. The longer you keep it from real use, the higher the degree of failure for a software. Now, in agile development, people often talk about doing demo at the end of a sprint. And when I was writing the book, Practice of an Agile Developer, my co-author, Andy Hunt, said, hey, what do you want to give us a recommendation? And I said, oh, demo at the end of a sprint. And he's like, yeah, that's boring. And then he said, what do you do on projects? And sometimes when you're writing, there's a disconnect between what you say as an advice and realizing what you actually do. I said, oh, that's simple. I take the product I'm developing and I have my users use it from the very beginning. He said, and that's what he wrote in the book. As a co-author, he said, demo and exercise. And this is a lesson I learned the hard way. I was working on a project years after this experience. I knew not to repeat this. And my boss called me one day and said, hey, Venkat, I have a project. You're going to be the lead on the project, and it's due on November the 1st. I said, that's great to hear, boss. Thank you. What can you say about the product? And he said, if you don't deliver it on November 1st, you are dead. And I'm like, that's very helpful. Thank you. So this was all about time and deadline, and I had no clue what the application was going to be. And this was down in Texas, where I used to work back in time. And I said, where are the clients? And they said, they are remote, they're not local. And this is remote when, I'm talking about 20 years ago, maybe even longer ago, when remote was not a thing in general. And I said to myself, how do I succeed with this product? And I called the project manager on the other side, the client side, and I said, hey, I want to work on this product. I really like to succeed. And he kind of laughed and said, that's a great idea. I would like to succeed too. And I said, here's what we're going to do. And we are going to start developing the application. And every week on a Monday, I'm going to send you this application, and there are 3 things I expect you to do. A, you need to tell me what you like. Always of positive feedback is good. So tell me what you like. Second, tell me what you want me to improve, not what sucks. Be positive again. What do you want me to improve? And third, tell me what you want me to focus on. And he said, gosh, we don't develop products like that. You go off and develop for a while, and when you're done, you give it to us, and we'll take about 30 days to look at it, give you a list of bugs to fix, and you fix it. I said, yeah, that's a pathway to failure. I'm not going to do that. And we're going to do this on an incremental basis. And he said, yeah, sure, that's great, let's do it. And the very first week, honestly, what can I do in 1 week when I have no clue what I'm doing? And I'm not even exaggerating this to you. I built the first version of the application. And all it had literally is a circle with the line on it, with the number on it, and that's all I can think of doing the first week. It was supposed to model an engineering unit, and I sent it off to him, thinking he's going to call my boss and say, who's this moron? Fire him. Is he kidding with me, sending me a circle? And on that Monday, I sent him this application, and he sends an email in 2 hours saying, here are things I like. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is going to really be a win. He actually liked something in the circle I sent. Here are the things you need to improve. And then he asked the question. He said, I got a question for you. You had a 65 on that line. I'm just curious, is that 65 inches or 65 millimeters? And then he says, you see, we need to really support multiple units of conversion. So is it an English unit? Is it a metric unit? And I'm like, my gosh, we're actually getting real requirements now. Because in the requirement document, there was nothing mentioned about supporting multiple units of measure, and now we are talking about having multiple units. Honestly, this was an amazing experience because every week, I would give them the product for them to use while I was developing, and I was getting active feedback while they were using the application. Now, obviously, how did this go? We actually released it a few weeks before the deadline, but the real fun was 2 months later, there was a lady who knocked on my door, and I've never seen this person in my company that I work for. And she said, hey, I'm from accounts receivable, and you, young man, you're in trouble. And she said, I'm like, oh my gosh, what did I do to cause trouble to the company? And she said, well, my records show that you worked on a product, and our contract says you have to fix all the bugs within 60 days. It's been past 60 days. Our record shows that you have never done any bug fixes on this product yet. So we're in trouble. We're not going to get paid for this. And I told her, my gosh, I'm so glad to hear this. There are no bugs. And she just literally laughed and said, that's the biggest joke. We always have bugs. And we have in thousands to fix. And I immediately dialed the boss on the other side, and I said, here, go talk to him. And she talks to him, and he says, oh, we've been using this for a long time. We've been very happy. Oh, just send me the invoice. We'll pay it. And she just left in disbelief. She's like, this never happened. How could you have a product with no bugs in it? And like, because they fix the bugs all that away as we're developing, we're getting the feedback to fix it. So that's a lesson I can learn from my failure in the past, is to say, maybe a real valuable feedback comes from real active use of a product. So what if we start developing application and start using it very early on? Now, today we live in the world of continuous delivery that we often talk about. But how effective are we in doing it? How effective can we get in doing it is a very important question we can ask ourselves. Another story I want to share with you here is a story of Coke. And this was back in 1985. Coke wanted to experiment coming up with a better Coke or a different Coke. And so they came up with what is called a new Coke back in 1985. Well, they renamed it to Coke 2 in 1990. And they discontinued in 2002. That doesn't exist anymore. But you may say, what went wrong here? The product didn't exist, product didn't survive. What's the problem with this? As it turns out, they actually did a good job. They tested this on 200,000 people. That's a pretty good number, isn't it? And most of them really liked the new Coke. And they said, oh, this tastes really good. And so they did fairly good marketing. They spent $4 million in research, and they spent $30 million in production cost. So that was a $34 million failure. That makes me feel better for the $15 million that other company wasted, right? So $34 million later went down the drain. What was the problem here? Well, as it turns out, after the product was released, people were voicing their concern. And one of the things was, changing Coca-Cola is an intrusion on tradition. Well, as it turns out, there are people who have tradition drinking a Coke the way it is. And you took something very traditional out of them, and they get extremely angry and offended, and this can be really a problem. So a few lessons we can learn. Customers preferred the traditional Coke, renamed Coca-Cola Classic, and tampering with an established brand, even if it is their own brand, is a very high risk. And this is something for companies to learn from. When you have a very successful product, you got to be careful in transitioning and moving forward, and that can be really hard if you're not very careful about it. I've heard stories of companies where they make a change to a product, and the customers are no longer happy because they were so used to their older product, they were so happy with the product, the newer version was a failure, partly because people feel like they had an amazing product they were using, and you really disrupted something that they valued and they were comfortable and using it. So it's important to evaluate what the strength of a product is before we go challenge it, especially, I would say, when it's our own. But this also leads to a similar experience, but in a different tone, is a story of riots, even deaths and boycotts. And this is kind of scary because you would never want to associate a soft drink with life of people. But unfortunately, this is the exact thing that happened back in the Philippines in the 1990s. And this was Pepsi-Cola that really wanted to improve their sales. And so they came up with an interesting idea. And the idea was they were going to put numbers in the back cover of their Pepsi bottles. So buyers of Pepsi would open the bottle, flip open, look behind the cover, and there'll be a number possibly on the back of the cover. If there is no number, you didn't win anything. If there's a number, maybe you won $20, $30, $40, or even up to $40,000. Now imagine, if you have a chance to win $40,000 by drinking Coke, most people will be tempted to buy Coke even if you don't drink that sugary thing. And so the sales went up, and they started selling more Pepsi in Philippines, and their sales went from 19% to 24% with a monthly sale of $14 million. And they spent $2 million on this sale. And you would say that's a pretty good return on investment, right? You spend $2 million on this particular initiative, your sales went up by $14 million. Hey, this is great. Well, so what's the problem? Well, they got creative. They said, isn't this really cool? We should really continue doing more of this kind of promotion. And so they decided to use a number 349, and they announced that this number 349 would appear only on 2 covers, and that would have really a lot of money that is associated with it. But unfortunately, though, before the extension, 800,000 covers were printed with the number 249 by mistake, because the company that they hired refused to listen to what they said. And they were told specifically, do not use numbers that were printed already. And they just didn't get that memo. And so they printed 800,000 covers with 349 in it, which really meant now the company needs to pay $35 billion to winners. That's not going to cut it. So what do you do when you have such a mess up? Well, they announced that they would probably give a few dollars and get it done, and a lot of people accepted it. But a number of people who got the 349 were not happy with it. There was riots on the street. Unfortunately, during the riot, 2 people actually got killed, and this was a complete mess for them to deal with, and they got kicked out for a long time. And so what can we learn from that experience? Like I said, I don't want to be on the news like this. Unfortunately, this is really a disaster. But this is a great example we can learn from every single day, because I work with multiple clients around the world. And a lot of clients are using various different companies to do their work. And when you have multiple teams involved and multiple companies involved in doing work, one of the very important, I like the music background when I say really bad things to happen, right? So essentially the problem in this case is when you have a lot of these companies interacting with each other, communication can fall apart. So it's extremely important for us to have a fairly good oversight. And if we don't have a proper oversight, it can lead to problems like this. And we need to have a really good communication as well. And we need to also really be able to manage risk really well also along the way. So when it comes to the organizations working with each other, I'm a big fan of this one idea in agile development, which is self-managed, self-organizing teams. But unfortunately, though, when I hear the word self-managed, I realize that nobody is actually managing, and that can be a problem in itself. So I really like to have an oversight and a good governance in any organization. There's a difference between a fine line between managing and micromanaging. You don't want to micromanage, but you definitely want to manage, and that's a line we need to draw very carefully. One of the stories I remember very clearly as a young fellow growing up is the day when I heard about the Challenger disaster. This was back in 1986, and this was a very unfortunate event. One of the school teachers was first time on the ship as well. And of course, the world took a long time to recover from that particular disaster. But what really caused the failure of Challenger? Well, years later, of course, we learned about the O-ring failure and how that led to things. But behind the scenes, there was quite a bit of lessons to learn. And one of the lessons was there were a few engineers, for example, people like Roger Boltzley, and these people were really quite worried about the chances of a disaster happening. And the reason is Challenger was supposed to be launched on a day when the weather was really cold. And as of that time, no particular spacecraft has been launched at that cold weather ever. So the engineers were doing simulations in the lab, and they were doing experiments, and time after time, they were finding out that when the temperature is so low, that the material was not reacting as it should. So they had data collected, and they went to their bosses and said, hey, listen, here is what our lab experiments show, that the material being used is not going to do well when the temperature drops so badly. We should really delay the launch, and we should wait for a better weather. Unfortunately, the bosses were under pressure from the government and the politicians, and they really were on a very tight rope for launching. So on one hand, they wanted to delay because it's not safe. On the other hand, they could lose the budget, and they had a lot of pressure from the higher-ups that they got to release, they got to launch. And as you know, the rest of the story is they ignored the data, they ignored the engineer. Roger Boltzley went 2 years after that, and he started talking about what he considered as one of his own failures in not convincing the management that they should really be able to stop it. But of course, pressure to launch really led NASA to ignore the data safety and made really pressure accommodate what they were doing. Well, one of the words of wisdom from Roger is that he says, make ethical decisions and stick to your data, he says. This is another thing I would say as developers, we should really have, and I'm going to use the word courage. And I've been very fortunate in my experience. Ever since I graduated from school and started working, I almost always, not always, but almost always had bosses who encouraged me to really speak my mind. And speaking freely my mind doesn't mean that I'm rude or impolite, but it was always about I'm being assertive and I'm being very direct. And my bosses would come and say, we need to do this, and I would clearly tell them as a programmer, I would say, no, we are not going to do this. If we go this route, we're going to cost a failure, we're not going to have quality. And I would tell them that I'm not in a position to execute the particular a task they provide me to do in the timeline they want me to provide it. And one of the key things I would emphasize is the people who disagree with you and tell you that something is not right or not possible are the greatest of your friends. The worst people to work with are the people who nod their head and say yes and be quiet, because they are the people who are going to help you to fail, not help you to succeed. And I always tell my bosses this. I give them a metaphor. The metaphor I give them is, I got 2 coins with me. I call it the happy coin and the unhappy coin. And both the coins grow all the time. And I tell my boss, when we make decisions like this, I tell my boss, boss, I've got 2 coins with me. I've got a happy coin, I've got an unhappy coin with me. And I'm going to give you one today, I'm going to take the other with me. And the other one, I'm going to give it to you in 6 months. And I can give you the happy coin right now. You'll be very happy. Venkat was, accepting to what you said. He said he'll get this done. So I'll leave the happy coin with you, but I take the unhappy coin with me. And in 6 months, it's going to grow bigger. And on that 6 months, end of the 6 months, when you receive the unhappy coin, you're not going to be very happy with me because I helped you to fail. Or I can give you the unhappy coin, which is very small. I'm going to leave you displeased. I didn't accept to do what you just said. But I'm going to take with me the happy coin. And in 6 months, I'm going to give you that happy coin, which is going to be bigger because we're going to have a better quality product and we can stand by what we develop. The choice is yours, which one you want. So the point really is, a lot of times, remember, I don't know a lot of stuff, you don't know a lot of stuff, so does the boss doesn't know a lot of stuff. But by collaborating and interacting with each other, we can arrive at solutions that can work, and we can ask these questions, what are the consequences? And this is an example we can learn from. I don't think most of what we do results in cost of life as much, hopefully not, but it can really cost of time, cost of money, and cost of business and cost of reputation as well, and we can learn from those as well. This really leads to one thing more ethical, which is what we can learn from the Volkswagen scandal. And this is where the programmers were asked to manipulate the system so that the systems would lie when the automobile was placed in testing versus on the real road. And so the software developers were asked to modify the program so when the program was in a test environment, it would lower the emission levels and show it. On the other hand, when the software was executed in production in the real world, it was doing what it was supposed to do. Unfortunately, though, this put human lives at risk. This also started, cheating on the numbers. And of course, in the end, between US and Germany, the fines exceeded $32 billion. But what's really funny about this is they wanted to go after the programmers who wrote the code, even though the programmers have been writing code because their bosses told them to write the code. But I would argue, at the end of the day, it comes to we are professionals. And if I'm a doctor, if I'm a nurse, have people's lives at risk, the decisions I should make, I am responsible for, and I would argue the same thing applies to programmers as well. I put ourselves at a very high level of responsibility, and so we need to take the responsibility for actions we do. And if we have bosses that tell us to do what is either illegal or unethical, it's our professional responsibility to stand up to those. And of course, this really can lead to a lot of trouble in the end, as it did for Volkswagen with trust and credibility issues over time. So essentially, that culture of deceit and programmers being blamed for writing code is something we need to really think about and learn from. This also goes to yet another more recent news, unfortunately, we can learn from, which is the failure of the Boeing 737 MAX flights. And as you all know, as this is very more recent in time, unfortunately, is that they wanted to come up with a new system that was in charge of navigation. And of course, 346 people died in 2 crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia. And of course, their entire fleet was grounded for nearly about 18 to 20 months. And in addition to loss of lives, which is uncompensatable in my opinion, but Boeing also lost about $60 billion in this. But what really led to this particular problem? What can we learn again? This again comes back to what we are doing in our profession that we can learn from. And the Federal Aviation Authorities found out that they had removed a particular requirement for training along the way, but they were not aware of a redesign that was done as part of that particular process. And the pilots never really got the training. They were never even familiar with this change in behavior. And of course, that led to these failures of aircrafts on flight. And of course, eventually they found out the company deceived people and in making these decisions, and which is really unfortunate. Once again, if you really think about it, those decisions seem like a smart idea on the day they were trying to make, but in the long run, did we really help or lose? And how can you answer the questions to these people who lost their lives? How can you answer about $60 billion revenue loss? That becomes a big problem as well for us to think about. So dishonesty to gain economic gains leads to erosion of trust and economic gains. But this is something we all can learn every single day in our works and in our own jobs as well. And we can think about how we can really, save ourselves and save our organizations, and of course the lives as well that we work in. And this really comes back to, thinking about how we can communicate with people. This leads us to think about cultures and crashes. But before I talk about culture, I want to emphasize the word culture just a little bit. I want to say that culture to me is not a country-based concept. Culture is not even an organization-based. Culture really, I would say, comes down to a team. I have been in several companies and where I would walk through a building, and within a matter of a few steps, I would see multiple cultures in the same building. So within even a company, there can be multiple cultures. So we can have a different culture, a better culture for our own teams, and then of course, start that and take it to the organizations we are part of. But we want to really ask the question, how does it feel to work in a company, work in a team? How do you feel as a member of a team that can make a big difference? But this goes to two separate issues we can learn from. And we want to look at the communication structure and how people are free in communicating back and forth. Do employees feel empowered to speak their mind freely? And I'll give you one of my own experiences about it a little later. But this really comes down to a problem they saw is a crash of Korean airline flight and another flight in San Francisco. And in both of these cases, what they found out was that the co-pilot and the flight engineer noticed that the pilot was making an error, but the captain had made an error, but they were too really shy to make a recommendation to the captain saying, Captain, that's a wrong thing to do, because a captain was considered to be a higher up in this particular hierarchy, and so they felt like they couldn't really challenge the captain. And this obviously led to a crash. But I'll share with you one of my own experiences that I had a while ago. And, I do understand that different people have different situations. But people often say, I got a mortgage to pay. I got a family to take care of. Well, everyone does. But I want to emphasize one thing, though. If you are not willing to lose what you have, you will never be able to gain more than what you have. So that risk is absolutely essential in life. If I feared losing my job, I can never ever do better than what I'm doing. And that fear can hold us back a lot. Well, I'm a little bit thankful because maybe it was my childish nature. I almost never feared losing a job. And that honestly helped me to keep my job most of the time. But I remember one company that I worked in, and I was working for my team. I had a really amazing boss. And the company went through a few acquisitions. And they came to me and said, we have a problem in a product. We really need to get fast and release. So we are going to borrow you for 3 months. So out of here. And my boss was not happy. He looked at me and said, remember, you still work for me. One day you're going to be back in my team. So you're on loan. Don't forget that. So I was on loan to this other product, and I was working with this other team. And I can understand they were in a lot of pressure. That's why they wanted to steal me from this product. They wanted to really go faster. And I remember taking the requirements. It was a very complex logic that had to be implemented. And I was sitting there at my desk, and I was implementing the code. And I'm a big fan of writing tests and writing code. And I'm a little slow in what I do, but I like to take time to do thoroughly. And I was building this particular complex, what we call as a property sheet. The manager of this other team that I was being loaned to, he was walking by, and I had my computer where they could see it from the outside. And he looked at it and said, whoa, and he walked in and said, that's an interesting property sheet you have there. And I said, yeah, we talked about this, a couple of days ago. I'm designing it, I'm implementing it. And he said, show me, let me see how it works. And I showed how it works. And he said, you're done. I said, no, I'm not done. I'm working on it, but I will definitely let you know when it's done. It's a matter of day or two before I get it done, but I'm making progress on it. And he said, well, Venkat, looks like it's done. I said, no, it's not done. I want to emphasize it. I'm still working on it. And then he stood up and said, Jay, Venkat is done with this property sheet. I want it to be integrated this afternoon. I want to be shipped it tomorrow morning. And I looked at him and said, you can have the damn code. You can go to hell with it. And he went to his office, picked up the phone, called me and said, Venkat in my office. So I went to his office, and he said, close the door. I closed the door, and he said, looks like things didn't go well between the two of us over there. I said, I'm so glad you noticed it. And he said, I don't like to be spoken like that. I said, great, that makes the two of us. I don't like to be spoken like that either. I'm a professional in this building. I do my work. You tell me what to do. You don't tell me how to do it. I tell you when it's done. If that doesn't work for you, I just quit. Any more questions? He said, I'm so glad we had the discussion. Let me know when it's done. I'll be glad to move forward. I said, that's great working with you. That was the last time he spoke to me. But the point really is, if you don't really hold your ground, you will never, ever, ever be able to achieve what is right. What is the worst thing that could have happened to me? He could have said, I fired you, which is great. I'll go find another job. But I'll have my integrity with me. And yes, I may not have a job for a day, a week, or two, or a month, but I would have my integrity. I know what I am. But if I just did everything I was told, then I have no clue who I am anymore. And that is something we, each one of us, have to decide every step along the way, and that was a lesson for me. And of course, I kept the job. I went back to my team to work after that. My boss still laughs about it and saying that this was an experience that you had with the other team. But that's what I learned from my team is, you speak now and tell me so I don't fail later on. And that was what was really imbibed in me, and that is something I learned the hard way doing that. Same thing about this is another thing we always get drawn into. Fixation leads to crashes. This was another problem, unfortunately, was a flight that went down in Florida in 1972. The crew was on the flight towards the Everglades, and they found that one of the landing gear indicator was malfunctioning. And when the indicator was malfunctioning, they noticed it. The captain said, look, that indicator is malfunctioning. Looks like there's a problem in the landing gear. So they sent people to look at it. The co-pilot went down, took a look at the indicator, couldn't find out what was happening. So the pilot, the co-pilot, the entire crew was now focused on this malfunctioning landing gear. Well, as they were going around and looking for this, unfortunately, they disengaged the autopilot. They didn't even know about it. But everybody was so busy attending to this, the flight was on a constant descent and nobody knew about it. And eventually, unfortunately, the flight crashed. They eventually found out that it was just a malfunction. There was no problem with the landing gear. But the entire focus was on this, that they lost sight of what was actually going on. And this happens a lot in organizations, and it happens to every one of us. Because when we are panicked, our entire focus is on, hey, what's wrong with that? And we lose sight of everything else that's going on. This is a lesson I've learned the hard way quite a bit. There was a company down in Portland who called me and said, we've been having a problem in production for 2 years. We don't know what's going on. And every so often at 2 a.m., our system will go down, and it would take for hours to bring it back up. We have tried everything. Can you come and help us? Now, remember this. I'm the stranger. I have no clue what this system is and what it's doing. And I walked in, and there was one guy who has analyzed every single log file ever. I call him the king of logs, because you mention the day and time before your sentence can be completed, you'll have the log file in front of you. He has been eating the log files for breakfast every day for 6 months. And everybody is angry and frustrated because they couldn't fix this problem. And when I walked in, they said, let us explain to you the system and what we are doing. I said, I'm sorry, with all respect, don't tell me anything. And they said, are you that good? I said, no. You know everything. You haven't solved the problem. How would it help me knowing everything you do? Obviously, it didn't help you. So let me ask you questions, and I'm going to be dumb. I'm going to keep asking questions, and I'll keep asking questions until one person says, hey, that question made me think of an answer. And that's exactly what I did. For a day and a half, I kept asking questions without knowing what I'm doing, but in areas where I was curious, until one guy in the room said, "Oh, explicit," and everybody stopped and said, "You," and he's like, "I know what the problem is." And this is one of the problems is we get so panicky, we tend to focus our attention in one area, we tend to really forget where else the problem could be. So bring an outside eye, bring an objective eye, and have somebody else look at it so that they tend to focus on a bigger issue and where the problem really may be, rather than where all of us are focusing, because our mind is very tricky. It may lead us to focus on wrong things in general as well, and we have to be very careful about. So stress can cause panic and distract us from keeping the focus on where we are heading, and everyone jumping on a problem at once may actually lead to a bigger issue as well. So don't lose sight of the overall goals in general. So those are some of the lessons that I hope that was useful for you as well as it's been useful for me. Thank you so much for your time. Enjoy the conference.